Hi everyone, I'm here today in Seattle in the McKillop Center to interview a guest. We have Don Antonucci, who is president of Regions Blue Shield in the state of Washington. Thanks, Don. Appreciate you making the time to come and talk to us today.
Hey, thank you, Steve. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just going to ask you a few questions, so let's just get right into it. What do you see as the biggest challenges your company faces over the next 1 to 2 years as we go into the further healthcare reform?
You know, it's a lot of the challenges that I think many of us all talk a lot about in the industry, but I'd say it continues to sort of hit ahead. It's really, you know, the lack of a better term, the triple aim phrase,
right,
where we're looking at cost, quality, and patient experience, all of us, whether it's insurers or providers, and trying to figure out how to make sure that we're hitting on all of those. And so, you know, one quick thing I get asked about a lot is the ACA and what's that kind of done. It's done a lot of things, especially obviously increased access for folks to access health insurance. But I would also argue that what it hasn't done is really address some of the underlying, you know, cost in the system. So that's just one aspect that I think it's putting more pressure on that because we really do need to.
Well, not to get into politics or anything, but what do you think about this, you know, repeal of the ACA or you know, getting rid of it? I mean, that train's already left, right? It's going to continue as it.
Yeah,
as it is.
and you know, again, I can speak for Regents and say that, you know, the other thing is, at the end of the day, what's really nice is what everybody I think wants is some predictability to the markets. And so, you know, I think ACA is here to stay, and I think it's done a lot of good. And now it's time to figure out how do you take that and then again focus on things like the triple aim and make sure that, you know, we're providing not just access and affordability at the consumer level, but then being able to go into the underlying system, because at the end of the day, as you know, we spend a lot in the United States on healthcare, and there is a lot of waste in the system. It's trying to figure out how do we get after some of that so that we can continue to make it more affordable for people to access.
And if you look at the triple aim, is it the quality, the outcomes piece that the toughest one, do you think, or are they equally tough?
You know, I think the tough part about the triple aim is trying to do all three. I mean, I think you can drive at cost, you can, and then I think there's a lot of work to be able to define quality and what does that look like, and what does quality mean, you know, and what is the true measure of that, not just for an insurer provider, but the actual consumer. And then, you know, patient experience. I think there's just a ton of opportunity there. I think a lot of times we end up focusing a lot on cost, but it really needs to be all three of those things to make things work. And so, significant challenge, but I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of good things happening that are starting to really, I think, get after that.
Okay. And if you're feeling the building shake a little bit, it's the train. We are not having an earthquake.
That's
so
good.
We're all used to it. But anyway, you know, physical therapy is a low-cost provider of services compared to other provider groups, provider interventions. And multiple studies have shown that if we use PT early, or if we get to PT first in musculoskeletal issues, that positive outcomes happen faster, and then we avoid the downstream costs of more expensive other interventions. So, why do third-party payers kind of see us as cost escalators when I guess the way that we look at it is we can actually save the cost of the triple aim that we're talking about with those musculoskeletal injuries?
Well, I think, you know, to take a step back from that question, I think the not only the economics of healthcare are broke, but the sort of the model is as well. So, you know, you could take any specialty almost or any procedure and say, you know what, there's certain providers that are doing this both in a low cost, really high quality way. There's others that would say that they are, that aren't, and then there's others that know that they're not providing it that way. So there's variation. I think there's so much variation, and we see it with our data and our transparency tools in cost and in quality, where you go, and you've seen the studies, if there's a certain type of specialty physician in one pocket of a state, for example, versus another, well, guess what? You know, whether that procedure is needed more or not, there's higher volume of that type of procedure done. Okay. So that's part of, I think that's part of the, I think what we have to get after there. But the other part of it is, you know, even if you look at, you know, so all the great things going on with cancer care or some of the new medications that are coming out. I think back to the model for a second, I think part of it is just the fact that I think a lot of people think, well, insurers are trying to save money. Well, a lot of times, yes, there's overutilization, but there's also underutilization, to make your point. I think about medication, avoidable medical costs. I think the number was like $190 billion in avoidable medical costs by people that don't take the medications and adhere to them the way they should. So to hit your question head on, I really think it's about how do you show that, and how do you show what kind of time frame that exists in, and then how do you define what the quality is of an organization like yours versus another, and make sure that, again, back to the AAA, make sure that there's some standards there so that we're all agreeing on what that looks like. And then one final point I'll make, because I think this is important, and a lot of times this gets missed, is that insurers many times are TPAs. In fact, so you think about businesses that still will continue to offer health insurance to a lot of folks, or health benefits. They're self-funded. They're more and more going self-funded. So a lot of times, and I think this is a good thing around the AAA and around costs, these are employers saying, hey, these are the dollars, these are their dollars paying for these claims. So the business community is wanting to see, all right, show me that. Show me, there's also a short-term mentality too. Well, show me that now.
What's my return on investment on this?
You got it. So I think that's part of what's driving this too, because the pressure on us is to be able to make sure that we're administering that well for them, versus if it's a fully insured piece of business for us, where Regents would be taking on the risk, where there's the care about cost. So all those dynamics, I think, come into play.
Yeah, that makes sense. Collaboration seems to be the buzzword in healthcare these days. Everyone's talking about it, but it feels sometimes like our efforts and overtures to enter into that collaborative arrangement with a company like yours has fallen on deaf ears, to be frank. And so, in the eyes of Regents, what does the collaboration look like? What's it going to be?
Yeah, well, I think when I think about collaboration, or I think about what's going on, and you know this because you and I know each other. However, it's when there's something that comes up, or there's a disagreement, or an idea, or a question about why would you do this and not do that. I think the answer is pretty simple. I think a lot of times it's actually building true relationships and collaboration to have that dialogue. I think there is another dynamic going on right now. There's so much happening in our industry with new partnerships, collaborations forming, acquisitions, and all that. And big ticket cost items too. Sometimes you mentioned this being a lower cost. There's so much going on. I do believe, whether it's insurers or providers or other, there's sometimes a bandwidth issue with how you start to pick apart, each one of these things and really get a model that makes sense. I'm a big believer, though, in no matter what it is, I think everybody or every organization should make time to at least have that dialogue and make those points and try to move that needle forward. But I agree. It can be frustrating because many times I think we all have our silos and the way we look at things. It's time to broaden that out. But I'm a big believer taking concrete next steps to get. And
do you think that we can really collaborate if the payer is unwilling to share the continuum of claims data, with the providers? Because that seems to be to us, it seems like you have all this information that isn't shared, and so how do we get over that hump too?
Yeah, and I think transparency of information, having that trust, having the right safeguards in place to be able to look at that makes sense. I think there's sometimes that notion that hey, you're trying to keep this and hoard this, or there's a viewpoint about what we have or don't have for data. I think a good example, Steve, is these accountable health networks that we've created, where we're trying to move away from fee-for-service into value, trying to get after the AAA. Well, what that's all really about, it's even though these large provider organizations are in our PPO, we're also now, we've created a product where they can select, because there's both quality gates that are set on it, there's also cost, and there's also a whole nother level of data sharing that happens between those organizations and check-ins. So it steps into
and how much of it is the IT issue? For instance, if we're on a fee-for-service system and we think that per diem may be a better way to go, we've been told that often your IT systems aren't set up for that. So when you come in to try and propose an idea, then sometimes it's the systems that get in the way, even though it's a good idea. Is that
you bring up a good point. I do think sometimes systems and IT gets in the way, and I think it's back to just some of the kind of business ROI. So I can tell you, a company like Regents and our parent company, which is called Cambia Health Solutions, the IT spend on the big ticket projects that come in and sort of the prioritization of that definitely comes into play. So it does.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that we would love to be able to move and do. I know I personally would love to see us move and implement it tomorrow or next month or next year, but it all has to kind of fit within that prioritization. And there's a lot of great ideas and projects that are there. So you start to look at and compare the ROIs, and I think that's where sometimes there's delays or times where we don't go down a path sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and you brought up trust a minute ago, and one of your senior medical directors closed a meeting that we were in once, and basically he just said, someday we'll be able to trust one another.
Yeah.
So. How do we build that trust and the collaboration? Because I agree, if we don't trust each other, then no partnership works. But if we can trust each other that we're going to do the right thing for the betterment of patients, or to hit the triple aim, it's a win-win.
Yeah, I think a lot of that trust is being able to, it's building a relationship, but it's also educating each other, right? Even some of the things I've just mentioned around the self-funded space and the employers and there's other organizations and industries that aren't in healthcare that are interested in healthcare as well, asking questions. And I think as you start to enlighten folks and say, just like I would love for you to understand sort of the pressures and the needs and what we're trying to do with our vision as a company, I need to understand what you're trying to do as well and why. And then once we have that understanding, doesn't mean we're always going to agree on things, but there should be some next steps, or there should be some data or a step that we can take together if there is some type of a barrier there. And if it's something that it comes down to, it's, hey, Steve, I love this, totally buy into it. Here's my problem. I've got these types of projects going on. I got some big ticket things, and this falls, and if that's the case, this falls off because of the IT, spend or this. Then I think it's important to have that type of dialogue with each other. I think that should happen more versus, hey, it's going to take time to build trust when there may be other things going on.
Yeah, definitely. If you were sitting in my seat as CEO of TAI, what advice would you give our leaders in dealing with Regents or a company like yours as we go forward?
Yeah, well, first, kudos to you, because I think you do some of these things. And so what the advice I would give is to, because it's obvious you're focused on things like cost and quality and things that we all talk about, and I think a lot of providers are. I think it's important to share that message, right? So I think whether it's presentations or conferences or one-on-one dialogue where you're actually sharing those proof points or your view on quality or what it is, you've done a lot of that. I think there's not enough of that happening in a real systematic way, and it doesn't have to take a lot of time. I'm not talking about, hey, we got to go do 3-hour panel discussions or things like that, but it's amazing when people do take the time to either bring in an idea or talk about what their organization does and do it in 15, 20 minutes, even as an initial conversation, how that can spread and work. So I honestly believe that's what it is.
Well, and I asked you about you taking my job. I don't think I'd want your job, because I think a lot of providers come at you with an axe to grind right away sometimes, and that makes it tough to build a relationship when you're already putting up the defenses. So.
Yeah, and I guess this is my view on it. I love my job because while there's a lot of challenges, there's a lot of opportunities as well in this industry and what we're doing. And as you know, it's Regents, Blue Shield, but also Cambia. We're doing so many other things that are way outside of the health insurance space, and I can give examples of those. But back to my view is really, and you have the same view, which is why we've created a connection and a relationship, is that, you know what, even when there's those tough times and those tough negotiations or dialogues, I'm still a big believer. I'd rather have a relationship with you so that we can actually tell each other where things stand and maybe come up with some options or ideas. And even if things don't work out, at least you can have that trust or agree to disagree on things as well. And if you don't have a relationship, I don't feel like you're at least taking those extra steps that a lot of times lead to a solution.
Yeah, and we've talked about this over lunch before, and we do have developed this relationship. Yet at our contracting level of both our companies, it's a battle royal.
Yeah.
So how do we get this type of dialogue down to that level so that we can actually maybe instead of drawn lines in the sand and holding your own. We can actually work together on it.
Yeah, and I think what that is actually it's got to take leaders like you and I and others to actually roll up our sleeves and say, all right, we've got this relationship. That's great. We can talk about some of these things, which maybe some of those folks would say that sounds great, Don, Steve, but that's pretty high level for what I'm dealing with right here in the trenches. And I think it's us understanding, both of us, what's going on in those organizations, even what's going on at a relationship level. Not that we're asking folks to necessarily build, relationships all the time at that level, but to understand what are the issues they're dealing with, why are the stances where they are, and then trying to find that next step. Because what's the alternative? It just continues like it always has.
Bang our head.
And things are changing, so we need to change with that.
You mentioned earlier about the consolidation in our industry, and all markets seem to be consolidating. Nationally, the big 5 insurance carriers are now becoming the big 3, it seems. 70% of Washington enrollees are only with 3 carriers. Is this positive for the landscape going forward? I would ask you, can Regence survive, or are you going to get scooped up by a bigger fish?
Well, I would say that Regence is going to survive. I mean, we're proud that we're financially strong organization. We are regional, so we're in Washington. We're also have health plans that are blue, or even other plans that are in Idaho, Washington, Oregon, Utah altogether. So we've got a nice regional setup there. But the consolidation, we're keeping track of it as well on our end. Whether it's providers, which are important, but also insurers. I mean, the news about Anthem and Cigna. I used to work at Anthem. That's one of those that's interesting. Now, the impact, it'll be interesting to see what the impact is outside of Anthem states, because there are blue rules and regulations about how all of that can work. I think it's more interesting to see, so how does that work with, sort of the branding and the work with Cigna, for example, in that case. What happens both in the Anthem states and outside of the Anthem states that they're in, because Anthem's in 14 states with blue marks. Right. So, you try to keep an eye on it, and you try to figure out where the challenges are going to come up from something like that, or where the opportunities can come up from it. I do look at this more glass half full, because there's a ton of opportunities I see coming up with just some of the major shifts and changes that are happening in the market.
Yeah, and is that from an efficiency perspective, or for more money, more opportunity? What are the advantages that you see?
Yeah, so I think there are some scale opportunities for insurers. There's efficiency opportunities. I think that there's, frankly, disruption opportunities that happen. I mean, I would say that aspects, when I mentioned the economics of the healthcare system are flawed, I think it needs some disruption in some ways where, when I talk about those accountable health networks that we're doing with some of those providers, we've almost agreed with those partners to do some disruption together, which is kind of a funny place to be, because we have the regular, PPO negotiations and things we do. Then we have these accountable health networks where we're partnering, but that's also a leap for those organizations and for us as well. And so it's this kind of funny place. But what I like is that at least you're not hearing many people say, "I just want to kind of, keep things status quo." There's a realization that things got to change. But there is some leaps that are going to happen.
Well, and there's that gap between, if you go from fee for service and just stop one day and go to per diem or some other payment system, you have to stay in business to do that. So there's that phase in that you're going to have to do, I think, to keep things rolling. So.
Absolutely.
I think we all believe that lowering healthcare costs cannot be achieved by these large hospital systems due to their fixed costs and their really high charge masters. I recall one of your executives again in a meeting saying that I've never seen a hospital merger or purchase that ever resulted in lower prices. In fact, they usually go up. So what can payers do to help private practices stay in business to offer patients a lower cost of service when we're trying to move that cost down?
Yeah. So my first reaction to kind of the beginning part of your question is, and then let me know if I've answered after I go through this, is that I think there's certain things insurers can do. I mentioned some of the examples that we're trying to do with these new partnerships and relationships that you would hope. I don't think, by the way, are the full answer, these accountable health networks, but I believe they can move things along. But part of the reason I love working for Regence is because we're not just focused on health insurance, right? We're focused on, Cambia is our parent company. the cause of that company, we call it a cause versus a mission or vision, is to serve as a catalyst to transform healthcare, making it person-focused and economically sustainable. Well, what that does, Cambia is made up of 26 companies, 7 are health plans, the rest are wellness companies, data transparency companies, big data analytics. I don't think, Steve, that there's one magic way to do that within our current fundamental structure. I think there is some low-hanging fruit. I think everybody would agree, oh yeah, wellness is good, prevention's good, all those things are good, and we need to double down on that and work on those things. But I think there's a lot of other dynamics in play or capabilities that you see coming out with technology that actually can continue to help to move the needle, get after some of the waste that's in the system. You hear the number 30% of waste that's in the system. We talked a little bit about non-adherence of medication. So I look at it, I think it's easy to get caught and say, all right, if we only could do this model, or if we only did that, or if it was only one thing. I think it's got to be so many different things with how, because the current system today is not sustainable, and we're getting to the point now where technology and usability of some of these tools is going to, I think, really have an effect. And you've got trends happening that we're going to encourage this. We mentioned self-funding. Why is that important? Because a consumer may use a transparency tool and look at an MRI and say, I can go here and get it for $1,500, or I can go here for $500. If they're on a low deductible plan, they're less likely to do that. If they're on a high deductible health savings account, they're much more likely to do it. If their employer self-funded, now guess what? Now the employer cares a whole lot about that, because they could be saving so that's one dynamic, self-funded. That you hear about defined contribution is another one. These models, these private exchanges, around defined contribution. So when people are using their own dollars, I mean, again, is this going to solve it? No, but if you're on a health savings account, I mean, the data shows you're going to be much more likely to pay attention to
the cost,
and also your version of quality, and what is the definition of that? What's the standard of that? So.
Well, you talked about trends, so not to pick on hospitals too much, but a trend that we see in our communities is that the hospital systems buy up the physicians. And so, and usually there's peer review studies that have been done to show that they can't sustain that because they lose money every time they do that. So if you have somebody that the only way to get your return on investment is to for them to do more with less, work harder, see more patients, whatever, at some point the physicians are going to rebel. And so I'm just wondering, there's some feel that those physicians will come out, go back into a private practice, but will go into kind of what we call like super groups, like a Polyclinic or the Everett Clinic or something like that. Do you see that trend? And if that's a trend, do you see that as a positive trend?
I don't know that it's always a positive trend. And I'll give you an example. I think this is still thinking about the current system today and what's happening, which is important. You got to keep your eye on it and figure out. And we've got investments as part of our portfolio, companies like Q-Liance, which you've heard about, and others that prepaid primary care. I'll give you another example of a company that we have. So this will kind of blows the model up a little bit. In some ways, can compete against the health insurance model. We've got a company called SpendWell, and what SpendWell is direct contracting with physicians and providers to take up the white space in their offices, basically. And why is it important? Well, it's a consumer purchase, cash pay, that many times is a better than what even Regents can have on a contractual basis. Why is that? Because doctors, I think, like to have the cash up front, right? So it's paid for, done, and it's convenient because the person can go and get that service. So there's these other models, and we'd say that's more of a retail model. There's times where that could fit in with an insurance company like a Regents, where on a high deductible. So I guess to answer your question, some of those arrangements may work better than others. Some are not going to pan out and work. But I think we've got to keep our eye on the bigger picture. There's other things at work, and who's to say that the model, even from an insurance standpoint, is going to exist the way it is, 5 years from now. And so I think I keep going back to what we're doing as a larger company when I hear questions like that from a Cambia perspective, because we're going to have to do a whole lot of innovation on the health insurance side, but we're also going to have to bring some of these other tools, and some of these we're going to have to see, when does that consumer engagement start to go and click, and what are other avenues to get access to care? And
then along those lines, telehealth seems to be a viable option for decreasing costs, but also improving access. So how does Regents look at that as far as, you know, the stick on that before was that, you know, it's hard to pay for people's time for that. So is that part of the plan, that you can be paying for more of those type of services as well?
Yeah, it's funny. This is something that came up in an employee meeting that we had. It's on telehealth, and you know, telehealth's been around for a while, right? And then now you hear things coming out like, oh, this is like it's a brand new thing. Now what has changed, right? There's some technology improvements and things that happen to encourage it, but I think it again goes back to, on that one, this is my opinion, I don't know what you would think of this, but it's how comfortable are people with this, right? And when are they going to be comfortable with it? Now, I can bring up the millennials, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we got to be thinking about, people just want to do things differently. They're not, you know, I think there's stats about millennials and brands, and you know, the minute, you know, that they disconnect from a brand, you know, it's kind of it's done, and they want things fast, and they want it the communication to be really quick and clear. That's very different than, you know, some of the way our industry works today. So I just try to think about it from that perspective and go, I got to keep that insurance, you know, hat on with all the innovations and things going there, but I think we got to look beyond it because I think the entire model's got to morph quite a bit.
Yeah, it does, and I think that, you know, we get back to the outcomes piece of it. To get a better outcome, you know, in our world, it's a lot of patients aren't, you know, as compliant with what we ask them to do outside of the time that we see them as we want them to be. So if there's some you know, way to connect with them in between the physical time they come to our clinic, you know, and reinforce some of the things we've talked about, that would be, in my opinion, a telehealth thing specific to physical therapy that could make a real difference in an outcome.
Yeah,
exactly. And save costs. So,
exactly. And I think in your model, Steve, I mean, a lot of times I know your organization, with how we're set up today, is focused on the insurers and what's going on there. I think there's going to be much more of that retail mindset that's going to continue to come in for, you know, it's going to be that value proposition that you just mentioned. Like, boy, the more you're able to do that and the more people talk about their experience with how you've helped them, right? That, I think, is something really, you know, again, sitting in your seat, you keep your eye on, because with what's gone on with the public exchanges and much more individual level purchasing, and what I mentioned about the private exchanges, which are supposed to, well, there's projections that it will outpace the number of people in even public exchanges. So what's that mean? Household level decision making, consumerism. I mean, and that's going to carry all the way through to the provider level as well.
Yeah. I don't know if you know who Dr. Chuck Kylo is of Greenfield Health. He's made a statement before where he said, "Why do we always look to the financing side of healthcare to solve our healthcare problems, when ultimately healthcare is a service provided by providers, so, or delivered by providers?" So. Can we really fix the broken system with just the focus on the finance? I think you've already said no. No,
so. I don't think we can. No, and I think we forget things. I mean, back to the triple aim, just to kind of beat that one. There's some good work happening around quality. There's some, you know, there's some good work happening around patient experience. But you know, I sit on the Washington Health Alliance board, which has some great data and things. Back to the variation in, you know, how many times, you know, somebody gets a mammography or colonoscopy. The variation across our state is astounding. The variation between commercial and Medicaid. So I just look at it. There's a whole lot of things that can happen coordination-wise to really improve the space. And then back to what you and I have been talking about a little bit more too, is that it's, you know, the models themselves are going to, I think, change quite drastically.
Yeah. You know, you were instrumental in getting us a meeting with Rob with Cambia Health down in Portland, and that was a great experience for us. But I'm wondering, tell us a little bit more about Cambia Health and how, from a provider perspective, how do we integrate with them, or how do we interact with them in a way that would be positive, again, to get to the win-win situation?
Yeah, and I think, again, back to you, you've done a phenomenal job with that, because you're one of few that, you know, has taken advantage of that connection point. I think one really nice way to do that, and you're familiar with this, is just to go and check out the Cambia Grove website. So the Cambia Grove, and just for folks, is sort of an innovation hub and center that I'm proud to say we actually located in Seattle, 9th and Stewart. And why is that important? Well, the reason that Cambia invested in that for the community is to make sure that we're bringing innovation. There was no place really for the healthcare community to have folks that could bump into each other from, you know, whether it's the investor community, entrepreneurs building businesses, and then people that are traditional part of the system. So we created that. There's programming there. We've got anchor partners that are part of it as well. There's a lot of great things happening. We didn't really know how it was going to evolve. I want to say it's about 5 months now in. And it's been amazing, sort of the traffic through there. The space is nothing like an insurance company would look like. And so it's things like that that I think, you know, an organization like yourself can take advantage of and, you know, interact with Cambia, but also, you know, potentially interact with somebody else that's just going to be a great partner from a different perspective for the organization as well. So I would encourage people to take advantage of that, and you know, it's back to some of the basics. I mean, get out there, network, talk about your story, you know, issues, problems, and how we're trying to solve a lot of these things.
Okay. Well, I've been asking you a lot of questions. Any questions you have for me, or anything I can?
Yeah. So when you think about strategy, or you think about the growth of your organization, what's that planning look like for you? Are you thinking about it, you know, 2 years out, 3 years out, 5 years out? How do you, as an organization, get your vision together and think about that, given all these?
Well, it's a great question, because you know, I personally think we need to look further out. You know, it's easy to look at that year to year. You know, this is what we need to do this year, and so on. But I think you need to look 3 to 5 and even 7 years out. So, what can we do in that space? And you know, we've used the word a lot today in this interview, but my new mantra is collaborate or die. You know, I just think that we need to find, as you say, partners, maybe through a Cambia Grove or other situations where we find people that we can do something together, and then we can go forward. You know, again, in our industry, what we see in the physical therapy world is we have a lot of very small private practices, and you know, to meet the compliance issues and the IT requirements and things like that is just, I think it's really hard. So you know, we could be an organization that could maybe not have to own those, but help them in a way from an MSO perspective or some other way to help them meet the standards that I believe are going to be required as we go forward, you know, in healthcare reform. Because it just can't be the way it always was. You've got to get to a higher standard and a higher level, and you need tools for that, and tools are expensive. So I just look at it as trying to collaborate and then look at it over a longer period of time.
And just one more question I have for you is that there's a lot of talk in our industry about the consumer, and I know Regents and Cambia for a long time has focused on the consumer, so it's kind of funny to hear folks say, all right, this is our new focus, it's all about the consumer. And I've actually been in discussions and things, panel discussions, where folks in the audience from the, you know, provider community or the healthcare community have said, I don't like that term, I think it's a, you know, patient, or it's a member or customer. What's your view on what the consumer is, and then what do you think, if anything, you have to do differently as an organization, given this trend around consumerism in healthcare?
It's a great question. I mean, I think, you know, it's a cliche, but it has to be about the patient. I mean, if it isn't the patient first, then what are we really doing? You know, so we've got to take great care of our patients. We've got to provide them services that change their life and make them go through life in a better way. So we need to have focus on that. But I think it's an interesting question, because I've heard that for a long time too, where people say, well, the consumer will be the person who drives the change. And I had an interesting talk with Jonathan Bush of Athena Health, and he doesn't believe that. He thinks it's the providers that are going to have to force the change. Because if we do things exactly the same way, then the consumer doesn't know what to do. So it's almost like, maybe it's the Steve Jobs thing, where they don't know what they want. We have to tell them what they want. So we have to show them a way to do things differently. And so I think if we can, you know, provide that exceptional care, get them better faster, show them the outcome that we can measure now, and do that, and then look to you and other payers to support that and reinforce that. I think that's how we make the difference.
That's great.
So
thank you.
Yeah. You know, just to wind it up here, so what do you think of those Seahawks? Are they going to have a good year? So.
Yeah, you know, I've definitely become a Seahawks fan for sure, and had the opportunity myself to go to the Super Bowl last year, which was great right up until the end. So I'm excited for the season to start. I mean, what a great organization. So
it's been a good run, and you know, it just made me think. I wasn't prepared to say this, but you know, Coach Carroll, the one thing that he does is he lets people kind of be who they are, but yet collaborate together for a better cause. So if we can get Coach Carroll to get us going in that direction, I think we'll be in a good position. So.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it
Thanks,
very
Steve.
much, Don. Thank you.